the lost son. I was just a simple man, living a simple life. My days were long and my work was hard. Every morning, before the sun rose, I left home to find work. I did anything to earn money, carrying heavy boxes, cleaning streets, fixing broken things. I was not rich, but I was happy because I had my family. My wife stayed at home, taking care of our little son. He was my light, my reason to work hard. Every evening when I came home, he ran to me with open arms. "Papa!" he called, and I forgot all my pain. His laughter filled our small house, making it warm and full of love. One evening I returned home late. My hands were rough, my legs were tired, but I smiled, ready to hold my son. But my wife was crying. Her eyes were red, her hands were shaking. "Our son is missing," she said with a broken voice. My heart stopped. I ran outside, shouting his name. The streets were dark and empty. I knocked on doors, asking neighbours, but no one had seen him. The whole night I searched, calling for him, hoping to hear his little voice, but there was only silence. Days passed, and I did not eat. I did not sleep. I went to every corner of the city, showing his picture, asking everyone, "Have you seen my boy?" But no one had answers. I walked for miles to other towns, to different cities, hoping someone had found him. But my son was gone. I felt lost without him. My home was no longer home. My wife and I sat in silence, waiting for a miracle. But the days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months. My son was nowhere to be found. I did not stop searching. Every morning I left home with hope, and every night I returned with pain. I asked strangers, visited police stations, and checked every lost child's home. But there was no sign of my son. My wife grew weaker. She barely spoke. Her eyes were always filled with tears. "Maybe he is gone," she whispered one night. But I refused to believe it. I held on to hope like a drowning man holds onto a rope. One day I heard about a child found in another city. My heart pounded. I took the last of my money and travelled there. My hands trembled as I knocked on the door. A kind woman opened it and led me inside. A small boy sat on the floor, playing with a toy. "Son?" I whispered. He looked up. My breath stopped. His hair was the same, his eyes familiar, but when I stepped closer, he pulled away. "Who are you?" he asked. My heart broke. It was not my son. I left that house with heavy steps. I walked through the streets, feeling lost. Was my son somewhere out there, calling for me? Or was he gone forever? That night, as I lay on my bed, I stared at the ceiling. My body was tired, my soul was empty. I had searched everywhere. I had no more strength. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Where are you, my son?" But there was no answer, only silence. Days turned into months, months turned into years. I still searched, but my hope faded. My wife became sick. She stayed in bed, too weak to move. I worked hard to buy her medicine, but nothing helped. One cold night, she held my hand. Her fingers were thin and cold. "Promise me," she said softly, "promise me you will live, even if our son never returns." Tears filled my eyes. How could I live without him? But I nodded. I promise. The next morning she was gone. I buried her under a big tree near our home. I sat beside her grave for hours, whispering her name. The house felt empty without her. I was alone, truly alone. I stopped searching. I stopped hoping. Life became simple. I worked, I ate, and I slept. I spoke to no one. My heart was heavy, but I had no tears left to cry. Years passed. My hair turned white. My hands grew weak. The world changed around me, but inside I stayed the same. A father waiting for a son who would never return. One day a letter arrived. It was strange because no one wrote to me. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was an invitation. Someone had invited me to a big house in the city. I did not understand why. I almost threw the letter away, but something stopped me. A small hope, buried deep inside my heart, whispered, "Go." I packed my small bag. I had no fine clothes, only my old jacket and worn-out shoes, but I did not care. I was not going to impress anyone. I just wanted to see why I was invited. The journey to the city was long. The roads were noisy, filled with cars and people. I had not seen so many people in years. Everything felt too fast, too bright. My heart beat quickly. I wanted to turn back, but something inside pushed me forward. When I arrived at the big house, I was shocked. It was grand, larger than anything I had seen before. Lights shone brightly, and many people stood outside, talking and laughing. I felt out of place. My hands trembled as I walked toward the door. A man in a suit greeted me. He smiled warmly. "Welcome, sir. Everyone is waiting for you." I frowned. Waiting for me? That made no sense. Inside, the house was even bigger. People filled the room, their faces familiar yet distant. Old neighbours, friends from long ago, even people I had worked with in my youth. They were all here. But why? Then the room became silent. The crowd parted. And from the other side of the hall, a young man stepped forward, his eyes locked onto mine. My breath caught in my throat. Could it be? The young man stood still for a moment, his eyes filled with emotion. My hand shook as I took a step forward. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. It was impossible. My son was lost. I had searched for years, and yet here he was, standing in front of me, a grown man. Tears welled up in my eyes. My legs felt weak. I wanted to speak, but no words came out. The room was silent. Everyone watched as the young man slowly walked toward me. "Father," he said softly. The sound of his voice broke me. I covered my mouth with my hand, trying to stop the sob that escaped my throat. My son, my little boy, was here. But he was no longer a child. He was tall, strong, and dressed in fine clothes. He had changed so much, yet his eyes were the same. He reached out and took my hand. "I looked for you for so many years," he said. "I never stopped searching." I could barely breathe. "My son, is it really you?" My voice cracked. He nodded. "Yes, Father. I have waited for this moment for so long." The people in the room began to clap and cheer. Some wiped their eyes. I could not believe what was happening. My son was alive. He was here, and he had never forgotten me. He led me to a chair and sat beside me. I built a company, he explained. I worked hard, but something was missing. I needed to find you. I shook my head in disbelief. I thought I lost you forever. He smiled gently. No, Father, we are together now. Tears streamed down my face as I held his hand. After so many years of pain, I finally felt whole again. The room was filled with warmth and joy. My son sat beside me, his hands still holding mine. I could hardly believe it. After so many years of pain and loneliness, my child had returned. He turned to me and said, "Father, I want you to come with me. I have a home in the city. You will never have to work again. You will have everything you need." I looked around my small house. It was old and simple, but it was my home. I had lived here for years, thinking my son was gone forever. Now he was here, offering me a new life. I sighed and smiled. "I don't need riches, my son. Seeing you again is enough. But I want to take care of you," he insisted. "You have worked so hard all your life. Now it's time to rest." Tears filled my eyes again. I never imagined this day would come. My son, who had been lost for so long, now wanted to give me a better life. "All right," I said softly. "I will go with you." Cheers filled the room. My relatives and friends clapped their hands. They were happy for me. I was happy too. That night, I packed my few belongings. My son stayed with me, talking about his life, his struggles and his success. I listened carefully, feeling proud of the man he had become. The next morning we left the village. As we rode toward the city, I looked back one last time. This village had been my home for years, but now a new chapter was beginning. I was not alone anymore. My son had found me, and together we would start a new life.